Hello, everyone. It is week 6 here at EOU, Eastern Oregon University, and the history of modern Germany. This week, we're going to be looking at the Nazi seizure of power. So we're going to be looking at the early 1930s. We're going to be looking at how effectively the Nazis seized power and transformed a constitutional democratic state, the Weimar Republic, into an authoritarian, ultimately totalitarian dictatorship. Our readings for this week are Pendersky Part 2, and we'll be looking at this book, which everyone should have, The Nazi State and German Society. This is a collection of primary sources, so we're going to be getting into some primary sources now, and we'll be reading the primary sources from source number 12 through 23 and 26, trying to keep the sources generally within the time frame of the early 1930s. And have a look at what Nazi Germany looked like in the early 1930s, particularly to the people that were experiencing it. And of course, a few weeks from now, we will have a primary source analysis paper that will be due. Please do look at the prompt for that before or early. I have it in this week's modules, so you can kind of be thinking about, as you start reading this, you can be thinking about how you might like to write your analysis paper. So see that prompt, it's in modules. I will have your thesis statements and sources examined and graded soon. And definitely be sure that you're delving into those resources for the research paper early. The better your research, the more thorough your research, the easier it is to write a good paper. Simple as that. Because the resources will speak to you, and that's really what the historian wants more than anything else. When you write any kind of historical source or work, you want the sources to really speak to you. Do lots of research, do thorough research, and then let the sources kind of tell you what the argument is, which is a lot easier, a lot more difficult than it sounds. Excuse me. But do the research early, and it will make the development of that thesis, because you'll probably start changing the thesis around. That's a very normal thing. When I was doing my dissertation, my thesis changed a number of times. And not radically, but small alterations. There was one radical change where I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. But it was because of the sources. I did the research, and the research said this was kind of the argument that I probably should make or could make. So do the research. It makes writing, it makes the development of your ultimate research paper a lot easier. So we're reading Pendersky Part 2 this week. We're also reading the documents from Mueller, document 12 through 23 and document 26. They're not long documents, and I think you will find them pretty interesting, I think. We're looking at the rise of Nazi Germany, the rise to power of the Nazis, which of course happens within a constitutional democratic state. The Weimar Republic is what we'll be looking at this week. And this is a really important topic for historians because, of course, today, like the kind of gold standard for governments in the world today is liberal democracy. Liberal not in terms of politics, right? Like liberal as in democracies fashioned in the ideas of the Revolutionary Age, right? Liberal democracies where people get to vote, democracies where you have free and fair elections, where people have individual rights, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the big questions, because today the gold standard in the 21st century, the gold standard is liberal democratic governments. And when we look at the case of Nazi Germany, here you have a case where within a constitutional democratic state, a complete dictatorship, an authoritarian dictatorship and movement was basically developed within the democratic state and actually came to power through a pseudo-democratic process. And that's a big question. How did this destruction of democracy and constitutional government happen in Germany? What types of lessons are there for the modern world since throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century? What types of lessons should we really be taking from this event in the late 20s and early 1930s? It's interesting, because of course Hitler was appointed chancellor at the end of 1932, which was a constitutional thing when there was no party that had a majority. It was the way their constitution was set up. The president had the power. President at the time was Hindenburg, an aging Hindenburg, had the power to then appoint the next chancellor. And Hindenburg didn't like Hitler, despite the propaganda that the Nazis would convey after Hitler's seizure of power. Excuse me. Hindenburg didn't really like Hitler, and he didn't really like the Nazis. And there were lots of people in German society that didn't like the Nazis and the SA and these groups that were really kind of agitators and fomenting extremely radical propaganda and ideologies. But Hindenburg had basically run out of appointments. He had appointed all of them, and so he felt he had a legitimate responsibility to appoint whoever the candidate was at that point who had received the most votes, and that was Hitler. I think he received 36% of the vote in that 1932 election. But Hindenburg, when he appointed Hitler, because there was a concern over it, Hindenburg and the folks around him believed that the constitutional checks of the Weimar government would prevent the most extreme abuses of Hitler in seizing power or in what he might like to do. And of course, we know Hindenburg was wrong. And in a rather short period of time, the country was actually voting in the Enabling Act. I mean, sort of. I mean, it's pseudo because there were lots of political opponents who had been arrested and were put in concentration camps or being harassed and these types of things. But the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers in 1933, that act, the process began then when he became chancellor after an emergency decree. But that act, it went through the German parliament, and effectively Germany voted to destroy its democracy. And this is really how that can occur is a very, very, very interesting lesson of history. And we need to think about that in all of the modern world today, all the democratic states today. Like, why did this happen? What types of lessons can we draw from this? One other assignment this week, and I'll get your midterms graded this week, and I'm really excited. I'm kind of looking through them, perusing through the ones that have been submitted. Looks like there's some really good essays out there, so I'm really excited to read both your essays and your short essays. So I'll get those graded this week, and you'll see my comments. We also this week have a film quiz, and basically I'm assigning you, and this will be related to the factoid I'm going to say here in just a second for the bonus points, but this week we have, I want you to watch 30 minutes roughly of the film, the Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Wills. And it's in English subtitles. And it's called Triumph of the Will. It's a propaganda film. And I want you to watch the first 30 minutes of that. And there's a little quiz in there where I want you to basically answer the question, why is this propaganda? What about this is propaganda? What are the Nazis trying to convey in this? What does it tell you about Nazi propaganda? So it's a propaganda film. I want you to watch that and take a brief little quiz. Just write a little paragraph. Watch it, write a little paragraph that basically answers the prompt. And so I want you to do that this week as well. Here's the factoid. One of the reasons why the Nazis grew in popularity in the early 30s, one, of course, is the Great Depression, because the Nazis were a fascist movement, so they're an extreme nationalist movement. That's what fascism is. It's extreme nationalism, right? And it's a nationalism that constructs the nation around a very distinct group of people, right? For the Nazis, it was the racially Aryan Germans is what they called them. And so that's what they constructed the nation around, these people, the Volk, right? But the German nation, according to the Nazis, was constructed around a racial group of people. But really, when you think about fascism, fascism is extreme nationalism, where the nation is basically constructed, or the nation is purported to be made up of a very distinct group of people. And this group of people and the nation, according to radical nationalists, is somehow under-challenged by enemies to this nation that exist both within and through globally, internationally connected conspiracies. Okay, so that's basically what Nazism looks like, or what fascism looks like. And the fascists then will go to great lengths to protect and expand this distinct group of people at the expense of those allegedly associated with undermining the state from within and abroad. So typically militaristic, it's a chauvinistic nationalism is often how it is presented. It is militaristic and extremist. So the factoid is this. So my point though initially was that it's the Great Depression. So radical movements like that, whether it's communist or it's far-right fascism, radical movements tend to be most popular when people are in desperate times, in hardship, right? And then they look for some kind of figure or movement to basically deliver them from that hardship, that perception of hardship. So aside from that, though, one of the things, too, that made the Nazis so successful in the early 1930s was the fact that, unlike most of the other parties and political parties in Germany, most of the other political parties in Germany, you know, there was a lot of older folks in the leadership. They didn't really, they weren't out there as much. Whereas the Nazis were constantly out there. The Nazis did rallies constantly. They made rallies into huge events. They would do some of them at night, which is a big thing. They did these affairs at night with like torches and stuff. And they made this big display of all of their rallies, and they did their rallies constantly. So they were constantly, you know, bombarding the people with propaganda, with untruths. And they did it constantly, and they did it through emotional events. The film you're going to watch, or the part of it, Triumph of the Will, is after they took power, but that's an example of a really, really huge Nazi rally, you know, after they've seized power in the state. But the Nazis, when they rose to power, they kind of put themselves on the map because they were constantly doing rallies. They were constantly doing events. They were constantly out there in the public. And as a result of that, they put their propaganda and they put their ideology out before the German people. And while a majority of German people undoubtedly did not believe the Nazi ideology the way that the proponents of it did, nonetheless, their presence, their ability to appeal to people's emotions in constant rallies and so forth was one of the things that helped to push them to greater political popularity, which, while there was still a constitutional state in place, the Nazi Party's popularity was probably in the realms of 30 to 40 percentile of the country. I believe the most votes that the Nazi Party ever received for the Reichstag was 39%, and I believe Hitler, the most votes he ever received was 36%. But of course, after they seized power, you know, true elections are, of course, a thing of the past in any way, shape, or form. So the factoid is that rallies. The Nazis used rallies constantly, events, as a way to bolster their support, to put themselves out there, to put their propaganda out there. And it were those rallies that helped to really put them in the political mainstream. And so that is the factoid for this week. I'll give you 2 points for it because this has gone long. Sorry about that. Let's have a great week. I will see everyone in the discussion forum.